the Age of Fission radio show with your host, Lonnie Clark. We stand together and accept that we now live in a world transformed by Fukushima. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time here on UCY.TV radio.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
We relentlessly engage every ear that listens. We expose and confront the complete lack of accountability for the nuclear industry. Consider social engineering programs who view our bodies, minds, and souls as assets on a balance sheet. We discuss vital current issues, interview activists, and engage our audience in an effort to allow all voices to be heard. The Age of Fission radio show creates a venue that all will choose. We encourage our listeners to reclaim their power and their courage to take action and save our planet from the ravages of greed and indifference. Our actions matter. Every voice matters. We remind our listeners that happiness is resistance. Love is greater than fear. Good morning, UC.
It's off. Berries and
Oh, hello. Good morning, UCY.TV radio listeners. This must be the day of snafus. So this is Lonnie Clark with the Age of Fission radio show, and it's Wednesday, which means we have activists interview activists and healers and people who help us live through this age of fission and give us real information. So today, to my great delight, I have an activist and from St. Louis, Missouri, Byron DeLear, and he is actually Mondays are our days that we dedicate to the catastrophe in St. Louis. It is summarily being ignored 100% by every news media outlet out there. So I have Byron on the phone on that. He's on joining us through the Skype venue, so maybe we can have a stronger call. So hi, Byron. How are you today?
Hi, Lonnie. How's it going?
Going pretty good. Boy, we had a little bit of an effort getting connected there this morning, but I'm so glad we finally connected. I'm excited to talk to you. So first, let me introduce you to our listeners. You're running for state representative in Missouri. Now, what seat are you running for?
I'm running for House District 70, which includes the cities of Bridgeton, Maryland Heights, a little bit of Hazelwood, and parts of St. Charles and Chesterfield. In the heart of my district are two landfills. One's on fire, and one is a huge cache of nuclear byproduct material from the Manhattan Project.
So you are full aware of all of the events and where they're at right now. And so what is your race looking like? What can people do to help you win this race? Who are you running up against?
There hasn't been any official candidates that have announced to oppose me.
Awesome.
I understand that there are some rumblings about some opposition. I did have a Democratic opponent a few months ago, and he publicly stepped down and endorsed me a couple weeks ago. And so we're sort of consolidating resources on the Democratic side of the situation. And, Missouri is a Republican-controlled state in terms of the state legislature, so it's important for the progressives and the Democrats to sort of consolidate their resources. And Howard Abrams deserves a lot of credit for stepping down and supporting our campaign. I've been pressed into the landfill issue specifically for 8 or 9 months now. I do have a background with dealing with these issues. I used to be on the Physicians for Social Responsibility Nuclear Nonproliferation Committee and have had some experience working on the Santa Susana Field Lab in Southern California, which is the location of the only uncontained partial nuclear meltdown in the United States.
And next to Porter Ranch, I might add.
Correct. So I do have some experience with that, and I do want to just make the announcement that Dr. Helen Caldecott, of course, the founding president of the Physicians for Social Responsibility when it restarted in 1978. She is making the journey to St. Louis and will be conducting a symposium this coming Saturday at the St. Louis Community College, and she'll be joined by Robert Alvarez, nuclear policy expert from Washington, D.C., and Denise Brock, who is an ombudsman for NIOSH in the CDC, and Dr. Sam Page and Mark Harder, both St. Louis County councilmen. But Dr. Sam Page kind of operates at the intersection between the medical profession and the political aspects of this orphaned cache of nuclear waste that's in the heart of our county of 1 million people.
Say his name again. Would you say his name? Dr. who?
Dr. Sam Page.
Mm-hmm. And what time is this event going to happen, Byron?
6 o'clock.
6 p.m. at a church, at the community college.
Yeah, St. Louis Community College Wildwood is the name of the campus.
Wow. I wish I could go. I'll be honest. I really wish I could go. I did contribute a few beans to Levy Halady so she could get there, but wow, I wish I could join you.
Beans are much appreciated.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it does. All of us matter, and it really does. Every little bit does matter. So, she'll be able to get there. I think, finding a room, traveling, and going to these events is. This is, in fact, what the nuclear industry counts on, is they count on us, we activists out here in the world, just not having the resources to help support each other. And so one of my things about having you on, because you are running for office, I mean, I kind of laughed when you said your opponent backed down. I'm like, what if he probably really looked into what's going on in District 7? He's like, I don't think I want to have to touch that with a 10-foot pole. So I don't think when you said there's no opponents, I'm like, no wonder nobody wants this. Like, bravo to you for having the courage to face it, Byron.
Some political issues have been described, if they happen to be particularly difficult, as being radioactive. Well, in this case, the issue is exactly that. It is literally radioactive.
This is my question. I know you've been involved in politics for quite a while, just from my understanding of you. And so I wanted to ask you this question. You're now actively engaged in this. Why is this not considered a health issue? How is it that our elected officials at these high levels can just put the blinders on? Like right now, St. Louis is really in catastrophic levels. It is not a small level of radiation that's going on in St. Louis. It is catastrophic levels. Same thing with New York, Indian Point. It's like 125,000% worse today than it was. 3 days ago it was 68 or 62%. Now it's. I think Indian Point is personally. It's my personal opinion. I'm going to do some research on what they're saying. I think it's headed towards a nuclear meltdown, and they're just not going to tell us like they didn't tell us with Fukushima. So how is it? You've met with Claire McCaskill. You've met these people, right? How is it that these people just put the blinders on to the It's not political. It's a health issue.
So, Lonnie, I know that you've been dealing with these issues, and this is sort of the focus of your show. And so instead of kind of attacking the surface of your question, I'd like to really get into the philosophy behind perhaps why this is a disconnect that is in our society. And it kind of stems from the whole industrial revolution of how society is structured. And that has to do with industrial specialization and compartmentalization. And so when you take into consideration the nuclear industry, there is this massive amount of financing and motivation behind the nuclear industry to harness the power of the atom. And this was supposed to be the promise of the new world coming out of World War II. And there seems to be a disconnect in regard to being able to have a holistic appreciation of the overall impacts of this industrial pursuit and how it has an effect on society and human health. And so in many senses, in a large respect, I think that there seems to be these walls of separation between the physicists and the engineers and the financial backing behind this massive nuclear industry on one hand, and then on the other hand, the ability to acknowledge that this radioactive waste that the industry is producing, and in the case of St. Louis, that radioactive waste stems from the production of nuclear weapons.
Right.
That the cleanup for that waste has never been on the real agenda of the Atomic Energy Commission in the 50s and 60s, or the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or even the Department of Energy today. And so, look at Flint, Michigan, for example. There's a perfect example of very concrete evidence of some serious poisoning issues with lead poisoning in the community, and the agencies just have a kind of a tone deaf response where they don't really consider it to be that big of a deal that people are actually being poisoned and perhaps even killed, and they kind of just look at it from an anesthetic numbers standpoint.
The benefits are worse the risk. That someone made money in Flint, Michigan. That's ultimately what happened. Someone's company made money by switching it over. I mean, they did this intentionally. They knew what they were doing. Just like in St. Louis, it's exactly the benefit outweighs the risk. That's the meat of the problem, wouldn't you say, Byron?
And so the role of the people is to eliminate all other options for these federal agencies. All other games of distraction have to be silenced, and the only option is to make these community whole and to bring healing to these communities. That's the role of the people. And sadly, we have to amplify that message and increase the public outcry to such a degree that we actually get a bipartisan bill from Senator Claire McCaskill and Senator Roy Blunt. In a rare fit of cooperation between the two parties today, they offered this bipartisan U.S. Senate bill to transfer jurisdiction from the EPA, which has been negligent on this radioactive site, the Westlake landfill, to transfer jurisdiction from the EPA to the Army Corps of Engineers, which has the capacity and the expertise to execute the cleanup. The Army Corps of Engineers, of course, Lonnie, they have been at the beginning of this narrative since the initial phases of the nuclear project for the United States. The Manhattan Project's original name was the Manhattan Engineering District. So the Army Corps has been at the beginning of this story, and the community believes that they have the wherewithal to remove this material, and the idea is to extract this material from the center of a county of 1 million people, remove it from sources of water, remove it from the densely populated area that it's in today, and put it in a licensed disposal facility that's not near population centers nor sources of drinking water.
I find I'm very happy that legislation passed, but I have to say there's two things that are addendums to this, though, that are really kind of still unconscionable, or several. The one is in Section 2, Section 2, Article 2 of both pieces of legislation, the one that passed the Senate and that's one that is waiting in the House approval. Section 2 gives cost savings effects is complete indemnification for past, present, and future to anyone. No one is held accountable. And I understand that was required to be put in, otherwise it would have never gotten passed. But I find that our elected officials are willing to do that unconscionable. The second thing is, I don't see a piece of legislation to help the families of St. Louis cope with the medical problems that they are going to have. I mean, we've seen immediate legislation coming out of Flint. Well, let's help the children that are going to be affected for the rest of their lives. What about the families of St. Louis? People have lost their children. Families, people have been prevented from having children. It is an unconscionable threat that has been going on in St. Louis. So and the second thing is I don't know if you followed up. I didn't have a chance this morning to look at it, but I do know that the the Committee for Environment and Public Works met in the House on February 10th, which was just a few days ago. I called my Congressman Peter DeFazio and asked him to please bring it up. He's a member of that. So we need to put pressure on to have, I don't know if it's passed out of the committee, but the committee in the House needs to pass that second piece of legislation immediately.
Yes, absolutely. It's House Resolution 4100, and it has not passed out of the committee. We are trying to go for a unanimous vote to pass that out of committee. I believe there's one congressman in New Jersey, Perone, I think is the last name, or Ferrone, who is having some concerns about the legislation. So I think that's the last vote that we need to get. So
What's
um,
his concern? Do you know what his concerns are?
I haven't heard specifically. This is secondhand information.
Wow.
So the Just Moms STL, which is the community activist group associated with the Westlake landfill, they just made a trip to Washington D.C. and I'll be receiving some reports from them tonight with regard to the results of that trip. But if any of the listeners feel inspired, please reach out to the New Jersey Congressman on the Environmental Committee. Frank Perone, I think is the name.
It's
But
Pallone. It's Pallone, Junior
Pallone.
Frank Pallone, and he's on the Energy and Commerce Natural Resources Committee. Although if you call his constituency line, they might just refer you to the Energy Committee. But his phone number is 202-225-4671.
Excellent, Lonnie.
Yeah, so we need to call him and ask him to please remove his objections. They only meet once a month, that committee.
Mm-hmm.
So, we missed our chance. So this is why the people in St. Louis are getting the shaft. Like, it seems this is my, can you hear my frustration, Byron? I mean, I am just dumbfounded at the lackadaisical attitude with which this issue of a public health and safety issue is just being shuffled along, and every person in Congress and in the Senate kind of go, yeah. I mean, like, okay, Roy Blunt and Claire McCaskill did great creating that bipartisan bill to help save their freaking city, but what about the people of St. Louis? There's no additional legislation coming out of them, like going, wow, we need emergency legislation to help these people cope with the cancer. I mean, the burden on our healthcare system, just St. Louis alone, must be, maybe that's why they don't want to admit it, because it is a financial burden.
Well, there have been some interesting work lately that is exploring the economic impact of all these sicknesses, and throughout North St. Louis County. North St. Louis County has been suffering a particularly difficult economic situation for decades now, and it's not too far of a stretch to suggest that these deaths in the families, in combination with the lack of health care for lower and middle income wage earners, that this has had a significant broad-based negative impact on the community. Just to give your audience a little bit about the history, St. Louis played an extremely pivotal role in the Manhattan Project, which was the secret government initiative to create the first working atomic weapons in World War II. St. Louis processed all the original the uranium that was associated with the first self-sustaining nuclear reaction in Chicago, and most of the uranium for the bombs for Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And there were a couple other sites, like, for example, in Niagara Falls, that were also purifying uranium, but the lion's share of it went through Mallinckrodt Chemical Works in downtown St. Louis. And the source of this uranium was this freak of nature in Africa, the Shinkolobwe mine, which had upwards of 60 to 70% pure uranium in the ore that they extracted from this mine. And that really led to the success of the Manhattan Project. Without that pure source of uranium, the Manhattan Project the timeline would have been kicked down many, many years past 1945, when they were able to bring the project to a conclusion, and World War II arguably to a conclusion as well. So the Mallinckrodt Chemical Works produced hundreds of thousands of tons of nuclear byproduct waste associated with the chemical processes that were brought to bear on this uranium ore to purify it.
That's my question. Why did it become so many hundreds of thousands of tons? Like, was it was all of the, I mean, did they make that many bombs that they needed to process that much uranium, especially since it was pure uranium? Why do we have all that waste?
So the uranium needed to be brought to a really high level of purity before it went onto the enrichment stage, or when it was sent to Hanford, Washington, to be turned into plutonium. The Trinity test in Los Alamos was a fusion, was a nuclear bomb that was a fusion type bomb with plutonium, whereas the weapon, and that was Nagasaki's weapon, whereas the weapon dropped on Hiroshima was a gun type uranium weapon. However, there are a whole host of chemical processes that are associated with purifying this uranium. And so ultimately, Mallinckrodt Chemical Works produced in excess of 50,000 tons of pure uranium through its processes. And this generated, we have documentary evidence of 133,000 tons of nuclear waste byproduct material that was eventually stored at the airport at a site called SLAPS, which is an acronym that stands for St. Louis Airport Site. And in 1962, and speaking of unconscionable, Lonnie, this is when the Atomic Energy Commission decided in some sort of fit of brilliance that they were going to auction off all the contents of the world's first nuclear waste dump, and they sold it for $1 a ton. They sold this material, 125,000 tons of it, to a small little firm called Contemporary Metals Corporation, and they issued a source material license, which by my lights was a violation of law because the Atomic Energy Act of 1946 explicitly defines nuclear byproduct material as exactly what was produced by Mallinckrodt Chemical Works. So they erroneously licensed this material, and it started through this nuclear hot potato phase where Contemporary Metals Corporation gave sway to Continental Mining and Milling of Chicago. That firm went bankrupt, and then Commercial Discount Corporation acquired the material, and then all the time the Atomic Energy Commission is reissuing licenses to these new private entities. Eventually, Cotter Corporation got the material in between 1966 and 1970. They shipped much of it to a nearby site called Laddie Avenue, which is also called HIS, or Hazelwood Interim Storage Site. And they laid it all out on the ground in the open so that it would dry, so that it would reduce the weight so they could ship it to their processing facility in Colorado. Meanwhile, they had about 10,000 tons left over that they didn't want to do anything with. They wrote a bunch of different disposal facilities and said, hey, can we dump this stuff at your place? And they got rejected. And so they decided then to illegally dump it in a municipal landfill in Bridgeton, Missouri, called Westlake Landfill.
Oh my God.
So 3,000 dump trucks, 3,000 dump trucks took this material out to this landfill and just dumped it out there. And to give you a sense of what 50,000 tons is, probably many of your audience are aware of the huge towering Gateway Arch in St. Louis, which is 630 feet tall. It's massive. It's made of concrete and steel. That thing weighs about 43,000 tons.
Wow.
So if you can imagine an amount of material equal in weight to that, but of a much larger volume, that's what's laid out in the open in the middle of this landfill with just a chain link fence around it in the middle of a county of 1 million people.
Well, that's what I'm speaking about, Byron. How is it that your senators, the people who are responsible at the federal level, are looking at this and turning away at the public health issue that this is causing? How can they possibly turn their minds off to that idea?
So there's quite a lot of competing narratives with regard to the real health threats of this material. And ironically, the reports and studies that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission did in the 80s and the University of Missouri and the Department of Natural Resources in Missouri, those early reports are more accurate than some of the later ones, because the later ones are attempting to sort of obfuscate the issue and insulate against any federal liability. But at the end of this analysis, Lonnie, and I've done this very focused legal analysis, I discovered this provision within the Atomic Energy Act itself, which has never been brought to the light of day. And this provision explicitly says that if any nuclear byproduct material which has been distributed with or without charge, if any of that nuclear byproduct material is mishandled, or it's used in a way that's a violation of law, or it's used in a way that poses a health threat to the community, or it's used in a way that's beyond the scope of the original licensure, and here's the explicit directive, the Atomic Energy Commission shall recall that material. Now, this is a peremptory command, meaning without debate. Right. This is the intention of the American people as expressed through their representatives in Congress and embodied in a law that is still the standing law of the land that orders the recall of this material to protect the public health and to protect national security. So I brought this to light in an expose I wrote for my column on Examiner. I write a column called The Progressive Examiner on examiner.com. I published part one of this expose in November, which prompted calls from the General Counsel of the Department of Energy, which put me in touch with the General Counsel of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And it's just very interesting that you have, I mean, that just shows the disconnect right there, Lonnie. I mean, here is the standing atomic energy law of the land that transferred the entire nuclear industry from military control of World War II to its civilian aspirations after World War II. This standing law of the land, for 40 years, nobody has ever brought this provision to the table.
And what did they say when you did that? What was their response when you brought
it? I'm not an attorney. I'm a student of the law. So I didn't believe what I'd read when I first read it, even though it was very plain in its meaning. I contacted leading nuclear industry litigators in Washington, D.C., and policy experts to determine if what I was reading actually sounded correct, and they confirmed it. They said that this holds water, that this is real, and this order to recall any mishandled nuclear byproduct material essentially preempts the entire Superfund structure and the whole PRPs, which identify the landfill owner, for example, as a potentially responsible party. And they had nothing to do with the illegal dumping. They had nothing to do with the illegal licensure. And more importantly, they had nothing to do with the national security equation of the United States, which is what this material is born from. The entire United States of America bears the liability for this material because St. Louis sacrificed itself in the defense of our nation. And the people that are suffering near that landfill today, those are folks that are suffering due to the defense of our nation. They are heroes left behind enemy lines. And that's why the federal government needs to step in and make this community whole again.
Well, what have you been in touch in regards to this law? Is there any type of an action or anything that's happened in demanding the NRC or the Department of Energy reclaim this and follow the law as mandated? Is there any effort to make that process happen? Have we gotten any response from them?
There are a number of conversations that are happening in the private sector and in the public sector with regard to what you're asking about. And in the spirit of being prudential, I probably should not discuss details of those different folks, but they are at the highest.
I can't help but disagree with you here, Byron. This needs to become a much more public issue. I would like to have some details so that we know who to go to sort of join forces with them. I think that this issue needs numbers.
Well, I will tell you that a friend and colleague of mine, who is the general counsel to the executive office of the president, his name is Hugh Brady, is aware of this issue, and the White House is aware of this issue. So in many ways, we kind of consider this violation of law that had occurred in the 1960s when you see the Atomic Energy Commission offloading tens of thousands of tons of nuclear byproduct material off of their balance sheet illegally. We consider this to be the original sin associated with this. And I would be remiss if I did not mention the Coldwater Creek community, which is also suffering due to this exact same waste. because those two sites that had these huge caches of this nuclear waste material, the airport site and Laddie Avenue, ostensibly those sites have been cleaned up by the Army Corps of Engineers. However, the Coldwater Creek ran through those two sites, and that acted as a mode of transport that took this material through several densely populated zip codes in North St. Louis County. Now, out of the three main caches of this nuclear waste material in North St. Louis County, you have the airport site, Laddie Avenue, and then Westlake. The airport site and Laddie Avenue have been remediated. However, Westlake is a remaining huge cache of this nuclear material. The Coldwater Creek contaminatory cleanup is in regard to how that material was transported because of flooding of the creek, and it's polluted churches and some local community parks and even backyards of residential neighborhoods. And so the Army Corps of Engineers, in a very sequential way, is cleaning up where they find it, and then they go search for some more, and then they find some more, and then they clean that up. And I have to say that it's unfortunate that it takes such a long time. And there is a perception that perhaps asserting this original issue of liability with regard to the Atomic Energy Commission and the illegal licensing structure that had taken place, that perhaps that will insinuate more funding so that these cleanup efforts can be expedited.
You think? I mean, honestly, this is an outrage that the White House knows about it. They should demand the Department of Energy take it over immediately. They have plenty of money. There's no reason. I mean, and when you say they've been remediated, that doesn't really remediate the sites. It doesn't really remove the radiation. There's radiation that they just can't remove in many of those sites, I'm sure.
There's a lot of material that has been left under structures that have been built, under highways that have been built.
It's like the freaking Keystone Cops, if you ask me. We're going to run here, clean up, run here, clean up. Look, anybody who has really honestly studied this stuff understands that this is catastrophic at every level. And while people may not want to move away from St. Louis, they are going to have ongoing health costs that the federal government ought to pay 100% for. These people have been grotesquely abused, in my view, by the Department of Energy and the federal government.
Well, Kathleen Logan Smith, used to be with the Missouri Coalition for the Environment. She's been on this issue for many, many years, along with stalwart activist Kay Dry. But she, importantly points out that what happens when some of these structures are destroyed in the context of redevelopment, what will happen to that nuclear material that was left under those structures. So this kind of just amplifies the point you're making, that this material never goes away. Helen Caldicott, in an interview I just published on Examiner, she says the half-life of uranium-238 is 4.5 billion years. Right. So this material, sticks around till the end of time.
Quite literally.
And that's why the industrial concentration of these heavy metals and natural substances in the context of the nuclear industry is very problematic, particularly when the kind of fusion power that we all really should be gravitating towards is the one that's 93 million miles away, the fusion reactor 93 million miles away, which is the sun. And we have this escalating increase of renewable energy. And I happen to work in the clean energy industry and energy efficiency and solar power. And if the motivation is there, we can power the lion's share of the entire needs of human society with renewable energy instead of digging thousands of feet into the ground and pulling all this black coal out of the ground and burning oil and burning natural gas, which is causing all sorts of problems for our environment. Not to mention the acute problems that are generated with nuclear waste and the fantasy that nuclear power really holds all the answers to our issues with carbon emissions and global warming.
I read an article over the weekend by an opinion article that if we turn away from nuclear, we're doing mankind a disservice. It was written by a pro-nuclear guy. In none of the articles that promote nuclear, they never discuss the nuclear waste. Never. I mean,
right.
That to me is the most irresponsible concession of the entire nuclear industry. And in fact, that is really the crime of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and that is their obligation. Like, I honestly, I cannot get over how dumbfounded I am to hear you report that the White House is fully aware of the issue, and they have not demanded the Department of Energy just recall this waste right away and stop messing around and waiting for Paul Ryan or one of these stupid Republicans to pull this legislation out of the committee. I mean, as they delay, people are dying. I mean,
well, yeah, as they delay, people are dying. And it also, I think it should be mentioned that the Army Corps has successfully removed over 1,200,000 tons of radiologically impacted material from North St. Louis County already. So, and
well,
we're
in
probably
those
talking.
areas where they've removed it, let me ask you, jump in there, just to ask you. In the areas where they have removed the radiation, the tons of radiation there, the nuclear waste, what are the Geiger counter readings? What's the EPA say about the people's houses around there? Are they going back down low, or are they still high?
It's hard to get forthright answers out of the EPA.
Well, what about the citizens there? Don't they have Geiger counters? Is nobody taking Geiger counter measures themselves?
I will say that there have been some independent efforts, in particular this new study that was written by Bob Alvarez, Lucas Hickson, and Marcos Caltafan, which has examined unsupported lead-210. And essentially, when you have a huge cache of nuclear material sitting somewhere, radon gas, heightened levels of radon gas will emit from that. And radon gas is radioactive. It's a nuclear daughter product of uranium and thorium. And radon gas has a half-life of 3.8 days, but in that time it can move miles off-site. And I'm sure you're well aware that radon gas is the second leading cause of lung cancer, and that's usually naturally occurring. However, you don't have radon gas in your lungs per se when you get lung cancer. You have one of the decay products of radon gas, like lead-210. So after that 3.8-day half-life, radon gas then turns into polonium and I believe bismuth, and then eventually it turns into lead-210, which has a half-life of 22 years. So what this study discovered is that there is large quantities of lead-210 in over 300 samples that they took, and this was a peer-reviewed scientific study in the Journal of Environmental Radioactivity. And what they determined is that this lead-210 most likely originated from these huge caches of nuclear waste material, with Westlake being the only remaining cache that has not been remediated and removed. And so what this translates to, all this kind of scientific technical talk, what this translates to is a massive health threat and poisoning of the nearby region to these caches of nuclear waste. And so this is kind of an emerging science, Lonnie, as you're well aware. Low-level contamination over long periods of time. There are not a lot of studies that really attempt to solidify the causation and causality. And as you're well aware, the industry uses those issues of dubiousness and against their liabilities associated with cleaning up these messes. And so when you have millions and millions of dollars being spent on legal efforts to silence communities, like you mentioned earlier in the show, it becomes difficult to go up against that machine.
Well, I venture to say, see, John Goffman, and I go back to John Goffman because John Goffman, Arthur Tamplin, and Linus Pauling studied the low levels. I have in my possession a book that's about 3 inches thick of study by study by study that they did that unequivocally shows that low-level radiation is extremely harmful, as have the recent studies coming out of Germany showing the very same thing. I venture to say that what has happened is the nuclear industry is stuck to the 90% rule. Dr. John Goffman studied how the U.S. government responds to scientific studies and responds to this. He said that basically across the board, the United States government, the military, the IAEA, and at that time the Atomic Energy Commission, which is now the NRC, deny that radiation causes harm if they can point to anything else, and they underreport the negative effects of radiation by 90%. Now, when I was reading that, I've started calling that the 90% rule, but they are sticking with it. And when you say it's dubious, the hairs on the back of my neck stand up because it's not, we don't have dubious effects. We have a dubious industry that is actually refusing to be real scientists and are using human species and every species on this planet as lab rats. We are all their lab rats. And the one thing they can't deny, which is why our government is having to face the music, radiation kills people. Bob Alvarez came out recently with a study that says we have an epidemic of thyroid cancer. Epidemic. So I really want us to change our language and our attitude. You see, my show is about radiation, exposing the lies of the nuclear industry, but it's also about the brainwashing, the way that we kowtow to these people and accept their pablum lies. I don't mean to go off here, but really, Byron, you're getting engaged in government, and this is partly why I was so excited to talk to you, because really, you are talking to people every single day in government and the government processes, and I don't know if you agree with me, but I think that is where we have to change the mindset. It's the elected officials have got to understand that this is a health issue that has long been proven. It's not
Sure,
unproven.
and educating the general populace as to the realities with which we face on the whole is absolutely key. And everybody needs to be aware of this. And shows like yours, Lonnie, that are part of the independent media are an opportunity to get much more greater granular detail into these issues with accuracy than perhaps what the mainstream media will carry, because the mainstream media has these kind of corporate firewalls that prevent a real, honest, rigorous, robust conversation about these issues.
Yeah.
And so when I appeared on Levy's show, Nuclear Hot Seat, or your show, I mean, I have been a fan of independent media for many, many years. I've been an independent media producer for many, many years. And so we are living in a new era where all the different communities that have been negatively impacted by these waste dumps, I mean, there is a Coldwater Creek in every state in this nation. There is a Westlake landfill all over the planet. And like, for example, when we connected with Patricia Amino in Parks Township, Pennsylvania, who just secured $350 million from the Army Corps of Engineers, after 2 decades of hammering this issue, she's finally getting some resolve and some resolution on her issue. And she's telling us, look, here's what you need to do. You need to get these documents. You need to go after these reports. You need to have an environmental impact study. You need to get the General Accounting Office to do an investigation of the EPA. These are all the different points that we need to hit. And being able to connect these activist communities is absolutely essential in getting the truth out so these communities can be made whole again. I'm sorry now that I'm going on a rant, but I just have to congratulate you, Lonnie, because you act as a pivot point between all these communities.
Well, I hope so. I hope that we do, because it is very urgent. And one of the things that as you are actually you actively engage in politics, Byron, which is why I really appreciate you coming on the show. Because I'm going to there's no, as you can tell, I don't really hide around the issues that I want to ask about. It's important that we have this honest conversation to help us learn how to get to our elected officials, because so many of them are really driven by the bottom line dollar. They know if they really stand up against the nuclear industry, they're going to be publicly smeared on billboards, on television ads. It is really like, this is why Claire McCaskill and Roy Blunt tiptoe around this, because the big money, I mean, Guy McPherson was on CNN and said they were asking him about the extinction event, level event that's happening, climate change. And he said he wanted to say how Fukushima is exacerbating the problem. They specifically told him, if you mention Fukushima or radiation, your microphone will be cut and you will not be asked on.
I just have to say that we have been very, very, very appreciative of Senator Claire McCaskill and Roy Blunt's efforts to work together to reach across the aisle, and also Representative Lacey Clay and Representative Wagner, who have joined them with the companion legislation in the House. It's really been an amazing victory to get a United States Senate bill passed, even if there's some little issues in there like you identified. Our hope is that that drilling down deeper into the original sin of the Atomic Energy Commission's violations of law with regard to the licensing of this material and their neglect in recalling the material once it was mishandled. Our hope is that legal approach will then complete the fix here, the set of solutions that are being brought to bear. The community here, Just Moms STL and the Coldwater Creek Group, are absolutely inspirational in their tireless efforts, Lonnie. They are of the same ilk as yourself. And I have been incredibly inspired by Dawn Chapman and Karen Nickel and, all the different moms that have been associated with this issue. And Harvey Ferdman, who has been the kind of expert working within State Representative Bill Otto's office. They have been at the beginning of this effort to really call attention and broaden awareness of this issue. Ed Smith of the Missouri Coalition for the Environment, Kay Dry, who I mentioned earlier. So
there is a sea change, and you're right, and I sincerely applaud them. And frankly, when I heard about this, I realized I only heard about this issue because I'm on the West Coast. I only heard about it like 4 months ago, and I was like, oh my gosh. And my hat is off to all of the individuals in St. Louis who are working diligently, because like Patty Amino, who worked for 27 years on an issue, the people in St. Louis have actively, forcefully been getting engaged for over 5 years, and relentless. No matter how many doors are slammed in their face, they keep going, and this is how we get it done.
And it's really, it all comes down to, I have met mothers who have lost their children due to brain cancer. Right. Kirby Pemberton, and there has been a lot of suffering because of these sites. Lonnie, what got you into creating this show and carrying this torch, so to speak?
So turn the interview around.
Well, I have been known to do interviews every once in a while. I'm sorry that I sort of put that hat on there. But
it's interesting. With St. Louis, what happened was my show just started in September. I was very actively engaged. There's another show on UCY called the Post Ignorance Project, and Kevin Blanche and I were partners in the Post Ignorance Project. I originally got this show to promote his show, and right before the show started, some things came up, and I just started doing the show. We parted ways, and I created a venue so that I could create something so people will get awareness. We have to get awareness out here. Libby Levy's show is great, but it's on the air once a week. She does a lot of great background work, a lot of great interviews. Kevin Blanche is an anti-nuke activist, but he's more like an anti-nuke ranter. You know what I mean? He rants. And so I wanted to give the people who, one of the things that really came to my awareness within the last year when I first got actively engaged post-Fukushima about the disaster of the nuclear industry was that at first I didn't think there was very many people out there. Just, you never see anything. It's really hard to find people. I had gone up to Hanford Challenge. There was only a handful of people. It was like, wow, why aren't more people actively engaged? So when I got the opportunity to do this show, I decided to create a venue where Mondays I used to read the nuclear alerts from the NRC webpage in the public comments section. And then Wednesdays I'd interview, and Fridays I still do have call-in Fridays and interviews on Wednesdays. But when I heard about St. Louis, it hit me like a ton of bricks. That is, in fact, the moms of St. Louis truly inspired me, because I realized they have been doing this for a long time. I saw a picture of a child who had just died. A lady, it was right before Christmas, or around November, I guess it was, and Thanksgiving was coming up, and she posted a picture of her child before she died in her hospital bed. I looked at that page and started weeping. I could not stop crying all day long. And I decided that Mondays, until we get real answers, and St. Louis, as you said, is all of us. That's the onion I have unpeeled. That's what feeds my passion. And so we have just been fed this pablum of propaganda lies while we're being used like lab rats. there is a St. Louis, over 60% of the Native American community is where the government dumped all the uranium tailings. Many communities in the Native American countries are seriously being harmed by waste from our government, and there is no responsibility.
We have some Native American leaders that are coming to the Helen Caldecott Symposium this Saturday.
Is this thing going to be? Is the symposium going to be broadcast, live streamed, or
there is going to be a stream? There is going to be streaming available, and I believe Lucas Hickson is involved in that. And so we'll be sure to get those links to you. I did have
because on Friday is the day when I'll be able to
continuing with wearing my hat as an interviewer here, Lonnie. I had a quick question for you. I read recently that Gina McCarthy, the head of the EPA, who neglected and denied to meet the moms who just went to Washington, D.C. after tireless efforts by the community and the congressional delegation to encourage Gina McCarthy to have a sit down with the moms. I mean, their tone-deaf handling of this situation is just absolutely unconscionable, to use that word again. But I've read that Gina McCarthy perhaps was involved in ordering the shutdown of radiation monitors in the wake of Fukushima in the western portion of the United States. Is that a sensationalist?
That's my understanding. Look,
or what do you know about that? Because I'm sure that you've been covering the Fukushima issue.
I have. This is my understanding. Jasko, the former head of the NRC, was flipped out. Like when he saw it, he said comments to the government that they did not like we have to warn the people. We have to tell people to protect themselves. They told him to sit down, shut up, and summarily fired him and replaced him with Gina McCarthy, who never saw a nuke she didn't like. And so, right after Fukushima, essentially, they turned off the radiation monitors all across the country. RadNet, $30 million project turned off. And Hillary Clinton went to Japan, even though the emails have come out recently telling her own people to stay inside. If they come inside, wash their clothes. And if they go outside, to wash their clothes when they come in if they can, because of the radiation fallout. She, a month later, went to Japan and promised the prime minister that we would no longer test our food for radiation from Japan. And in fact, to this day, we don't. And the United States is one of the largest importers of food from Fukushima. So if you ask me, what do I know about it? I think that these people are being run. My opinion, this is strictly an opinion. From what I can see, there's another force running our government. It's not the White House. The White House is taking orders. The nuclear industry, basically the IAEA, they run the show. It's complete silence world. This is why I talk about social engineering and programming, because it really does control people's mindset. It's the reason why we don't have people placing their bodies in Jay Nixon's office saying, we need you to declare a state of emergency so we can get funds in here, because people are afraid of standing out.
Well, people need to really study the history of social engineering and manufacturing consent. Noam Chomsky's book, Manufacturing Consent, the BBC documentary called The Century of Self. It's a 4-part series that talks about Edward Bernays, who was part of the propaganda industry during World War I and post World War II, and all the different efforts to consolidate the ability to regiment the public mind every bit as an army regiments its soldiers. And so this is absolutely key. And the corporate propaganda and corporate systems of propaganda, this is their lifeblood, is to obfuscate and to throw a bunch of chaff into an issue, to distract the public mind with bread and circuses, if you will. And, the information and communications revolution asserts a very simple principle, which is power's legitimacy is directly proportionate to its transparency. And this is where we are. This is where we're going to be moving in the future. And so it would be to the success of the powers to be to embrace this notion, because they can still offer solutions and be a part of solutions as opposed to hurting folks. with everything on the table. But everything's going to be on the table in the future with the Internet of Things and streaming data all over the planet. And so this is where we're headed. So might as well embrace that notion of transparency now in the fullest sense than trying to fight it.
Well, this is what I say, Byron. I don't think it's really transparency. It's like, let's let real science be respected. This has been an experiment that has failed. Right now, we have Indian Point. I believe Indian Point is in the process of melting down. 125,000 times more dangerous than it was last time. I mean, they summarily ignore it. But, my thing is, blame looks backwards, responsibility looks forward. I mean, I could live with the complete indemnification processes for the past, but for the future, no, we have to draw a line and say, okay, let's put our scientific dollars into remediating the nuclear waste, trying to figure out how to neutralize it, and spend our money in medical processes that are non-nuclear that help people cope with the effects of nuclear radiation. I mean, one of the things Dr. Caldecott talks about is that the very first sign of nuclear low-level radiation is diabetes, and yet in our country, we blame everything on diabetes. It's kind of like this win-win situation for the people that are, they're going to laugh all the way to the bank while they completely kill everything on our planet. I mean, it is up to us for us to stop it and decide that we have to call our elected officials and demand that they stop participating in using us as lab rats.
Absolutely.
I
guess we're kind of coming near the end of the show.
Yes.
So
we have 3 minutes left.
I did just want to share some more information about the upcoming event, or just repeat it. So this Saturday, February 20th at 6 p.m., we're going to have Dr. Helen Caldecott conduct a nuclear symposium on the perils of nuclear waste, with a particular attention to the huge caches of radiologically contaminated material and radioactive waste here in St. Louis. She'll be joined by Denise Brock, who's the ombudsman for NIOSH, and Denise has an amazing inspirational story. She's a St. Louis native, and her parents both worked for Mallinckrodt, and through her work as an activist and then later as ombudsman for NIOSH, she has helped expand the special cohort status for many of these nuclear plants littered all across the United States, and gotten and successfully delivered compensation to the atomic energy workers that have worked there. And in particular, this is due to the lack of accurate documents and work records, and even in some cases altered documents and destroyed records. And so she has been part of legislation that has said that if an atomic energy worker can show that they've worked at a facility for X amount of years, then if they have one of these sicknesses presenting, then they are due compensation. So they don't have to go through that long, sordid dose reconstruction process. And so this is kind of one victory in opening up the federal government and admitting that, hey, this stuff is dangerous just in general. You don't have to specifically prove your exposure, but if you're near it and you have been associated with it, then you deserve compensation. And I know that that's, could be perceived by some as a half measure, but, we do live in a world of increments, and this is one of the incremental victories. And Denise Brock is just an amazing inspirational story to forward that. Also, we have Bob Alvarez is going to be presenting, in addition to Dr. Sam Page, Councilman Dr. Sam Page, and Mark Harder. Kristen Camiso, who's one of the moms with Just Moms STL, she'll be displaying artwork at 6 o'clock at this reception. So it's going to be at the St. Louis Community College Wildwood campus, and I would just encourage everybody to go to that if they're in the region, and if not, to stream the presentation live, and those links will be available. If you want to find out where that information will be, probably the best central repository for that would be the Westlake Landfill Facebook page, which has over 18,000 members today.
So, Byron, we have about 15 seconds to go. I want to thank you for this lively discussion, and thanks for turning the tables on me. No one's ever done that. It's kind of fun. But I encourage everybody, put your courage feet on and take some action. Do it afraid. It really matters. Your voice matters. Thanks for joining us, Byron. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Lonnie.
Take care.